Hi, I'm Mike Kirby, and what I'd like to do is talk to you tonight about mental illness and mobility. My introduction to mental illness began when my older sister, who was then in her mid-20s, started to suffer from depression. The family knew she was down, although none of us knew why. Because of the stigma attached to my sister's mental illness, my family never sought treatment. Consequently, her depression got worse and worse. She became anorexic and then attempted suicide. Thankfully, the suicide did not succeed. That's the bad part of my sister's story. The good part is that after the suicide attempt, she went for treatment. And she got better with the help of pharmaceutical drugs, a psychiatrist, and most importantly, a person my sister called her spiritual advisor. Not spiritual in the religious sense, but spiritual in the sense that indigenous people all over the world use the term, meaning treating the mind and body holistically. My sister then went on to university, got an undergraduate degree and a master's degree. I tell you this story so that you will know that people who get a mental illness can, in fact, lead a reasonable life in spite of the chronic nature of their illness. Mental illness affects an individual's mobility in three quite distinct ways. First, mental illness impacts their personal development mobility and makes it much more difficult for a person with a mental illness to develop their intellectual skills and their interpersonal skills. Second, mental illness very severely impacts a person's social mobility. The stigma attached to mental illness impacts a great many people who do not want to have a relationship and indeed, frankly, are afraid to have a relationship with someone with a mental illness. This in turn leads to social isolation and very little social action or social mobility. Third, mental illness almost always impacts a person's employment mobility. Even if mental illness does not affect the person's ability to do the job for which they've applied, they are frequently turned down because an employer does not want to take on what they perceive to be the risk of employing someone with a mental illness. These three impacts on mobility stay with an individual from the onset of their mental illness through their senior years, unless the illness is properly treated when it first arises. Now, when we think about mental illness in seniors, we usually think about dementia in all its related forms, including Alzheimer's disease. The social mobility impact of dementia is particularly acute. The social isolation often results in the patient's illness getting worse. The lack of social mobility accelerates the decline in the patient's physical and mental health. But dementia-related illnesses are not the only mental illnesses which impact seniors. There are many seniors who have had a mental illness for decades, which, particularly in the case of mood disorders such as anxiety and depression, began when they were children, but like my sister, were not treated until the illness became very severe and acute. This lack of treatment is partly to do with stigma. And while considerable progress has been made in the last 11 years since the Senate report started the current debate on mental illness, out of the shadows at last, we still have a very, very, very long way to go before we have truly been successful in attacking the stigma of mental illness. But the lack of treatment is also caused by the structure of Canada's healthcare system. When Medicare began in 1967, the only healthcare costs which were going to be covered by public health insurance, or Medicare, were services provided in a hospital or in a doctor's office. That restriction, with very few exceptions, continues today. Consequently, the cost of psychotherapy, which is provided by a registered therapist, such as a social worker or a psychologist, that cost is not covered by Medicare. This makes psychotherapy beyond the financial means of many, many, many Canadians, indeed most Canadians, as psychotherapy services would have to be paid for out of pocket. Psychotherapy is the ultimate example of two-tier healthcare in Canada. And nowhere in the healthcare system is this more of an acute problem than in children and youth mental health. About 50% of adults with a mental illness, 50% of adults with a mental illness had the onset of that mental illness when they were under the age of 14. 70% of adults with a mental illness had the onset of that mental illness when they were under the age of 17. Mental illness starts as a young person's illness. But because of stigma and financial cost, only 20% of children and youth with a mental illness get treatment. I simply ask you to reflect on the reaction in the country if 20% of children and youth with cancer got treatment. The illness, as a result, stays with these children into adulthood and becomes their lifetime companion from childhood through adulthood and into their senior years. This lack of treatment is completely and utterly unnecessary. As more than 80% of youth with a mental illness, the initial mental illness they have is a so-called mood disorder. It's either anxiety or depression. These are illnesses which can be successfully treated by psychotherapy. It is frankly totally and completely inexcusable that public insurance does not cover this service for our young people, but rather condemns them to a life of having mental illness until they ultimately pass away. Canada's young people deserve to have the barriers of social mobility, personal development mobility, and employment mobility removed. But unless this policy gets changed, Canada will continue to have seniors who needlessly suffered all of their life simply because their illness, their mental illness, was not treated when they were young people. Clearly, it is high time that federal and provincial policymakers accepted the fact, as Canada's Indigenous inhabitants did centuries ago, that no one is truly healthy unless they are also mentally healthy. Thank you.